This is Proxy Countdown. Welcome to the big show for the week of June 30th, 2025, alongside my tag team partner, Matt Mascardi. I'm Damian Rollis on today's countdown. Netflix says no. Flex pays for failure. ISS flip-flops. Failed attendance at Vertiv Holdings. And on the big vote, Matt looks at sneaky director appointments. Let's start with our top stories. We have a lot because we're covering the last 2 weeks. Netflix rejects Jay Hoag's resignation, saying Mr. Hoag's continued service as a member of the board is in the best interests of the company and its stockholders, despite the glaring flaw in its logic that 79% of stockholders said no.
That's their math. They were really only referring to the other 21%.
Let's look at a bunch of new hires over the past 2 weeks. DTE Energy announced that COO Joy Harris would be the new CEO, succeeding Jerry Norcia, who will become executive chair. Joy is a double ceiling breaker, becoming the first black woman in the role.
Yeah, but still daddy's staying on the board, right? Like whenever you see that, that's the important part. The important takeaway here to me is the other guy is sticking around as executive chair for some reason.
UDR's new CFO is David Bragg, who lasted only 16 months as CFO at Roots Management Group. The new interim CEO at Hormel Foods is its former CEO, Jeffrey Ettinger. For 15 months of service to provide cover for poor succession planning, he will get a salary of $1.2 million, a target short-term reward of $2 million, a one-time equity grant of $7.2 million, and 10 full weeks of paid vacation.
I don't know why they didn't just give him a 12-month contract and say the rest is your vacation.
The new CFO at Pure Storage, Tarek Robiate, who lasted as CEO of Ring Central for only 5 months and has not held a full-time executive position since 2023, will get about $30 million in equity awards.
Holy moly.
More than a third of which will vest simply over time without performance-based conditions. We're seeing so much CFO turnover, and I think there's clearly collusion in effect, which is everyone's quitting their CFO role after a year and then demanding a massive equity package to be hired, and they're all doing it together. It's got to be collusion.
But this one's fast. This is like if there's a shortage of, like left fielders. And so shortstops were all taking the job of left fielder because you could get paid more. A CEO saying, never mind, I'd rather be a CFO right now because I can demand a $30 million equity award and get nowhere near the amount of pressure that the CEO gets.
He'll be gone in a year, mark my words. Starbucks appointed 2 Uber network directors to its board. Dambisa Moyo is on the boards of Chevron, Condé Nast. She previously served on SABMiller, Barclays Bank, 3M, Seagate Technologies. And then there's Marissa Mayer, previously the CEO and director at Yahoo. She's currently on the boards of Walmart, AT&T, and Hilton Hotels and Resorts. She used to serve on the board of Nextdoor. These are 2 very highly networked directors.
Women, though, so good.
Overboarded women, which is we see a lot of in big companies.
Yeah, we do see a lot of that.
In circumventing the alternative democracy news, something Matt's going to cover later, Netflix appointed Airbnb CFO Eleanor Mertz to its board a mere 16 days after its annual meeting. At PayPal, they appointed Deidre Stanley 19 days after its meeting, and at MicroStrategy, they snuck Peter Breiser Jr. onto its board 19 days after its meeting, and they're giving him a Golden Hello Equity Award valued at $2 million on top of the fact that he is due to receive about $500,000 in annual director compensation. Pretty crazy.
this whole section triggers me. It triggered me so much, I'm going to do a section on it at the end.
Here's some more money for hanging around news. We're seeing a lot of these packages recently. At Somni Group International, they renewed the contract of CEO and Chair Scott Thompson. He gets a $10 million cash transaction bonus for the company's acquisition of mattress firm and 1.2 million stock options valued currently at about $22 million a year. This is why it pays to not only be the CEO, but also to chair your own board. Flex CEO Ravathi Advaitai gets a one-time supplemental equity award valued at $25 million if the company's relative total shareholder return over a 3-year period is below the 25th percentile.
Wait, below?
Below. She gets $50 million if that shareholder return is below the median, and she gets $62.5 million if it is at or above the median. This is just absolute pay for failure. It's just ludicrous.
Wait a minute. The highest tier is at or above the median?
At or above the median. $62.5 million. She gets $25 million if it's below the 25th percentile, if they underperform essentially all of their peers.
What kind of pay package is that?
I did a triple take on that one when I saw it. Howmet Aerospace has renewed the contract of its CEO and chair, John Plant. As such, he will get a special, they always call these special or one time, he'll get a special retention award of restricted stock valued at $45 million.
That's valuation today, right?
Yes.
That's not, yeah.
And finally, Starbucks. All the named executive officers are getting a surprise July 4th back to Starbucks bonus. That's what they call it. Back to Starbucks bonus. Just for staying at their jobs. So this equity award is worth $6 million if an operating expense reduction is met, and up to $12 million for the achievement of the easiest set of goals known to humankind. I've never heard of easier goals than these. Ready? The rollout of the company's Green Apron Service program. That's the first one. Second, coffee house uplifts. And third, new food and beverage platforms. And fourth, a reimagined Starbucks rewards program.
They were already doing all that.
Yes.
That's their job.
Absolutely true. And finally, I'm going to end on a nice one. In a tribute to simpler times, here's the announcement from Crawford and Company. On May 20th, 2025, at the Contractor Connection Restorer Conference, Larry C. Thomas, Global President of Platform Solutions of Crawford and Company, announced his plans to retire from the company effective at the end of the year. Mr. Thomas has been with the company since 1983. Matt, isn't that great? Retiring at a conference. Isn't that so old-fashioned?
Surrounded by your friends.
Making a speech. I just love that one. I love that one.
That's good.
All right, let's move over to our proxy cage matches. We have a lot of ISS in the news. First, ISS recommends withhold votes on long-tenured directors at Brookdale Senior Living. That's Lee Wilansky and Victoria Freed. ISS says, given the tenure and positions of Wilansky and Freed, they are arguably the most culpable among incumbent directors. And this is in response to a proxy contest there from an activist investor. Last year, in 2024, Wilansky got 99.6% support and Freed got 98.8% support. So something's magically changed over the last few months.
Well, what also magically changed is that Frank Bumstead was not targeted by an activist investor, is longer tenured and 82 years old, and somehow...
And controls the influence on the board.
Escaped any sort of scrutiny.
Over 80 years old, too. Also, ISS supports a compelling case for change to Astronova Board of Directors. ISS finds that change at the board level is warranted to improve independence and oversight. Last year, Matt, the entire board got 97% approval. I don't know what's changed. Again.
It's warranted.
And finally, ISS is advising investors to vote against the re-election of Shari Redstone to the Paramount Global Board, citing concerns over the company's governance and executive pay structure. These are problems that have been going on there for decades. They also recommended a vote against 3 women, Barbara Byrne, Linda Griego, and Susan Schumann. Last year, the vote specifically against Redstone, only 2.4% against her re-election and 12% abstained, which is highly unusual. I don't think I've ever seen such a high abstain vote before. But clearly something has changed once again.
Also a controlled company.
Yeah. Oh, it has been for forever.
So
these governance concerns I remember complaining about even before I started working at MSCI.
So why are we citing governance concerns this year for Shari Redstone?
Good question. Texas enacts a new law to regulate proxy advisory firms. Speaking of ISS, SB 2337 aims to limit proxy advice based on non-financial factors. This is their terminology, non-financial, such as ESG and DEI, and requires proxy advisors to provide a specific financial analysis for any recommendation in opposition to management's position.
Interestingly, though, yesterday or maybe 2 days ago, the DC Circuit ruled that SEC rules about proxy advisory firms that limit what they can do actually violate the law. So you have Texas on one hand saying that proxy advisory firms should need to be regulated in a way limiting their proxy advice, and the DC Circuit ruling that the SEC rules that limit proxy advisory firms violate the law. So eventually this all gets up to the Supreme Court and somebody bangs a gavel and decides whether or not ISS should be looked at.
Look, I mean, when you wedge DEI into any issue, it's clearly about race. And it's funny to me that you can consider the hiring of actual people to be, that's non-financial, your staff, the hiring of people.
ISS is doing its darndest one story ago to just get rid of all the women before they have a problem with Texas.
And lastly, Lamb Weston reached a settlement with JANA Partners, allowing the activist investor to add 6 new directors, 4 JANA candidates, and 2 other mutually agreed upon directors. The JANA candidates include a former Lamb Weston executive chair, that's Timothy McLevish, and JANA's portfolio manager, Scott Ostfeld. So sometimes these activist investor campaigns, even though they tend to get the attention of, ISS and everybody else, they seem a lot like vanity when you're putting your own people in there. But
yeah, that's always the catch. It's you somehow manage to simultaneously point out a massive governance problem with the people on the board and then ruin your own argument by adding your own people to that board who have no business being there.
Finally, let's cover the vote results table over the last 2 weeks. Proxy season is clearly dwindling down, just about over. I only saw 33 large cap annual meetings. The story remains the same. Only 16 total shareholder proposals. So backing up all the news that we're seeing, there is just no shareholder proposals this year. These came from only 9 companies. Really only 2 wins overall. Like I say wins in quotes. None of the shareholder proposals won. But shareholders voted down an increase to the equity plan by 8 million shares at Viridian Therapeutics. And a director, Jacob Katsube, he failed to receive a majority votes, but I'll cover that a bit later. It's because, of course, of failed attendance. There were 7 moral victories. Those were votes where over 30% said yes. Nothing much to say here. eBay, 49% supported to call a special meeting. So eBay, why don't you do the right thing and just pass that one? And then how about this weird one? At BJ's Wholesale Club, who knew? This is their first ever shareholder proposal. They IPO'd in 2018. I haven't seen any other shareholder proposals. A GHG emissions reduction proposal put up by Trillium ESG somehow got 30% support, 3-0. I don't know how that happens.
3-0.
So anyone listening to this show who puts up shareholder proposals, target BJ's Wholesale Club. That's a very friendly shareholder group.
Apparently, some shareholder there really wants. I mean, to be fair, a basic GHG emissions reductions goal is so very 2017.
Yeah,
so
we've been seeing them get like routinely. They seem to get about 10% now support.
So the fact that BJ's even has it on the docket at all suggests that BJ's might be way behind the times.
Maybe the shareholders were just excited to have a chance to vote on something. The biggest shareholder disconnect over the last 2 weeks was definitely at CoStar Group, where a really loud no vote against Say on Pay. 46% said no to pay. That's a very high vote. And yet, the lowest support for any director was a 4% no. So 96% support for director was the highest there, the lowest, meaning that the rest of them got 97, 98, 99. So crazy disconnect. People,
I don't know if you know this, but someone has to write down the ideas for the pay in the first place. There's a group of people that do that.
I like this one. I call this a shareholder connection. This is like ESP. I don't know why this happens. Delta Airlines and ANSYS both had a shareholder proposal act by written consent. They both basically got 42% support. Now, how are they aligned?
Well,
how? I don't know.
Well, ANSYS obviously needs to fly places. So.
Right. And then finally, let's look at the directors. Once again, there's not a lot to say. By and large, most directors getting high 90s support, high 90s percentage. Vertiv Holdings is the only real story. Jacob Kotsube attended only 50% of the aggregate meetings last year and was not able to attend the balance due to last-minute emergencies and other extenuating circumstances. That didn't fly with shareholders. They usually are okay with medical emergencies, but not last-minute emergencies. So a full 54% said no, but they weren't done there. This is a feisty shareholder group. Joseph Van Dokum got 46% of the vote against his reelection. And I'm guessing because he is the chair of the nominating committee and there is only one woman on this board. That's my guess. I don't know. Only 1 out of 10 directors is a woman at Vertiv Holdings.
Well, let me read to you what we said on our June 9th
is that right?
Proxy countdown. This is a quote. We did this on the show. So what are investors this week going to do about this? This being the attendance failure as the only thing we care about. You have a shot at a no vote on attendance at Vertiv Holdings.
Oh.
They do infrastructure for data centers. And I read out loud, Mr. Kotsube attended 50% of the aggregate meetings. We pointed out that Kotsube, if you were going to vote on just attendance, Kotsube has 4% influence. He's on 2 boards, Vertiv and Ryerson Holding boards. He bats 570 for TSR and 451 for earnings. He actually was paid, we did the math, where he was paid $255,000 per meeting that he showed up to. But the worst performer on the board was actually Roger Fraden, who batted lower in TSR, lower in earnings. He was connected to 30% of the board. And if you were going to vote on a metric outside of just attendance, that metric that you could have voted out Roger Fraden, who underperforms. But instead, we guessed that we'd see a no vote on Kotsube, and that's exactly what we saw. No one voted out Roger Fraden, but they definitely voted out Jacob Kotsube.
Here's an interesting thing that I want to follow up on in the future. One thing I would like to know is that when there is a bit of a negative energy in a shareholder group, so they're already upset at Jacob Kotsube, does that carry over to other parts of the vote? Are they already feeling emboldened to vote no on other things on that same ballot? Is that why we see Joseph Van Dockum getting such a high vote against?
I do think once you've sort of analyzed something, you've broken the ice, then you realize there's often other things wrong.
Which it's the activist investor theory, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's basically regular investors become activists. And if it takes a director attendance failure to turn a regular investor into an activist, then guess how many times that's going to happen? Almost none. You're not going to see it that much. But look, and we pointed this out on the show. If your only characteristic that is going to force you to look at the actual directors on a company is attendance, you're doing it wrong. There's a lot of metrics that you can use. And the other person that you're voting out on this board is Joseph Van Dockum, or 46% no, it might as well be a vote out, simply because they chair the nominating committee, having no interest in who actually performs on this board. That's problematic.
Finally, kind of in a vote that kind of sums up the tone of the 2025 proxy season at MasterCard. Okay, so they had 2 votes on race, essentially. One from the anti-DEI crowd and one from the normal people DEI crowd. So maybe this tells you you were talking about like there's a proponent spread, right? Like certain proponents are automatically getting low votes just because everybody hates them. Maybe this demonstrates that, Matt. So MasterCard, again, 2 votes. SEIU Master Trust put up a racial equity audit report, and the National Center for Public Policy Research put up an affirmative action risks proposal. The anti-ESG vote was 0.4% yes, and the normal people got 11% yes. So maybe that's it. That's the spread, 10.6%. Is that it? Is that the proponent spread?
That's that in this case. Yeah. The proponent spread. I like the idea of proponent spreads. And maybe this is something we should do when we do proxy season review, because the only way to talk about shareholder proposals, I think, is not so much on the merits of the proposal. I think it is on the proponent spread. And I still am not going to get over the fact that like one guy named Gus voted yes on that. 0.4% that's like one person's retirement.
Yeah, that's
fund.
the most virulent racist in the group. That's it for me. Let's move over to the big vote. Matt, what do you have to do? Oh, you're talking about circumventing the alternative democracy, right?
Yeah. So the story that got me here, and you mentioned it at the top, was the PayPal story.
Yep.
How at PayPal, Deirdre Stanley was snuck the right word? Onto the board.
So. I think so.
19 days after the annual meeting.
Yeah, which, to interrupt you quickly before you begin, which means, without a shadow of a doubt, is that the company knew that Deirdre Stanley was about to join the board. These things don't happen overnight. They certainly don't happen in 19 days.
So I talked about this on our Business Pants podcast today, but we know from executive search firms that the average placement for a CEO is around 220 days. That's on average in the last 5 years. Now, there's some that take a lot longer. There's some that they need to go really, really quickly. But we know that it takes, a couple of months. You're talking about 200 days is a solid, 8 months of work, at least, to get this done at a minimum. So in this case, we'd assume if it's a director, maybe it's half that. Maybe it's more like 100 days. So in Deirdre Stanley's case, when 100 days prior, if they open the search 100 days prior, it means A, what they did was expand the board and they added Deirdre Stanley. They knew they were going to expand the board at least 100 days prior, which puts them at early March, which is a full month and a half before the proxy. And they must have figured out it was going to be Deirdre Stanley before, at a minimum, before the vote results happened or the actual AGM happened. So investors are not informed that they are expanding the board and adding another person until after they've already voted.
Well, this is how unserious this process is, because let's just hypothetically say that you already have 2 CFOs on the board. And then the company sneaks a 3rd CFO on the board. Let's just say hypothetically, maybe shareholders think that's too many. Maybe they only think that we only need one chartered accountant who works for KPMG, whatever it is, whatever the case may be. But what the company's saying is, no, we don't really care how you think that these boards should be structured and balanced. You don't get to have a say in that.
So here's what I did, because I wondered at PayPal, like it would be easy to be triggered about this, and I saw that, and you've been pulling these for the last 5 or 6 episodes, and noticing this pattern. I actually decided, well, let's go into the data, and I'm going to call them the plus 30s. These are 30s. People. It's AGM date plus 30 days.
Okay.
Right?
A month. Basically.
How often are directors put on a board within 30 days of the AGM ending?
Okay.
In fact, I've got a couple of categories here. There are the plus 30s, but there's actually worse. So here's why I want to dive into this. Because for these directors, most directors are awarded, they have cash that they're paid for their directorship, and they get equity awards. The equity awards are vested right before the AGM. In the event that they get voted out, they want to pay them for their service for that year. So they vest right before the AGM. It's effectively a 1-year vest. If you are a director for the entire term, it's a 1-year vest. These directors would get a pro rata share of the equity awards and the cash retainer. But if you join the board on day 19 after the AGM, your pro rata share is basically the entire share. So you are appointed to committees, you are paid almost nearly in full alongside everybody else, and you are effectively an incumbent going into your first election.
Yeah, and let's not forget, we're seeing more and more big golden hello equity awards for directors now. I reported this week at MicroStrategy, the new director there, he got $2 million just for joining the board.
And that is before any investor gets to vote on that person's pay or whether they're even qualified to be on the board. So at this point, the owners are not choosing their representatives. The representatives are sort of choosing themselves. And knowing that the average tenure of a director is 7 years, once you crack it, that means 14% of your tenure is over before investors actually weigh in on whether they want you there. 14% of your tenure is over. It's like you got to see the first act of a 4-act play before, you had to pay, someone actually had to let you in the door. So I got to thinking how many times this happened. Here's the methodology I used. I got the last 5 years of AGM dates. I got the director start dates for all companies in the U.S. in the last 5 years. And I only did U.S. because this is a uniquely U.S. problem. I did not see it when I was done outside of the U.S. I only focused on non-executive directors, and I tagged them if they started within 30 days or less of the AGM. So how many directors had no accountability for at least a year? Basically a full year. Here are the results. The average days for director ads in general is plus or minus 90 days from the AGM. Okay. So on average, 3 months before, 3 months after the AGM, you see the bulk of director ads. So it's not actually that uncommon for director ads to be clustered around the AGM. Which is, a lot of that has to do with retirements.
Okay.
A lot of that has to do with, term expirations, and you need to fill a role in advance of the term expiring. Like you are announcing that somebody's joining, or they join the board and then the person leaves, at the AGM.
Well, I understand before the AGM, it's the after part I don't understand.
Yeah. Well, I mean, most of this happens before the AGM.
Okay.
The majority of it is in advance of the AGM. In fact, I saw some that were, 180 days before the AGM, someone would join. Like there's a range here, but 292 directors were added within 30 days of the AGM ending in the last 5 years. Right. 292 directors. 79 times directors were added inside a week of the AGM ending.
That suggests something nefarious. I'm sorry.
These plus 30s happened at 227 companies, meaning There are companies with multiple directors where they've done this. Some of them have a good excuse. Some of them are because a merger agreement takes place. It gets voted on at the AGM, and then a day later or 3 days later, all the people as part of the merger agreement join the board. So when I started looking at that, I excluded them, right? There were still 29 companies. These are not mergers. 29 companies added a director one day after the AGM happened.
No sense to me because
in the last 5 years.
They also have the ability to make changes at the meeting themselves. We've seen shareholder proposals being added and subtracted on the day of the meeting.
Yeah, of course.
They could just add a director to the slate and say, we need to vote on this too.
The fact is, we know that investors would basically agree with the director.
Well, that's the irony here.
They would vote them in, right?
They would vote them in anyway. But why wait?
But here's the worst of the worst. The worst of the worst was Rockwell Automation.
Okay.
The only U.S. company to do this 3 years in a row, 2022, 2023, and 2024.
So they're doing it systematically.
It's basically systematic. In 2022, Robert Soderberry was added to the board after the board was expanded one day after the AGM. They expanded the board and added him one day after, right? He was not in the proxy. There was no mention of the expansion in the proxy or any of the 8Ks. In 2023, Philip Holloman retired the day of the AGM and replaced by director Alice Jola one day after the AGM.
Now, was that retirement announced in the proxy?
Holloman was on the proxy. No mention of retirement in the proxy.
That's wild, yeah.
Jola was not in the proxy.
Huh.
For both of those, a person named Colmanson was the chair of the nominating committee. And Holloman was on the nominating committee, and as was another person named Keene. So the nominating committees are effectively the same for both of those. In 2024, Rockwell expanded the board again, adding Tim Navish one day after the AGM. Board expansion seems to be, and I'll get to this in a second, a common theme here, where you expand the board and add a person. The expansion, again, not discussed in the proxy, nor was Navish up for a vote. At this point, the nominating committee has flipped. The common directors at Rockwell Automation, Parfait has been the lead independent director for 15 years. He's actually overseen a CEO transition there. Keene has been on the board for 12 years, on and off the nom committee. And Moray, the CEO, has been there for 7 years. But it seems like this is the Parfait show, right? This is Parfait or Parfait. As lead independent, air quote, director at 15 years, this is now your pattern. This is what you do.
I'm sure that the Rockwell Automation Investor Relations team is listening to the show, so reach out and tell us why you're doing this.
Yeah, please let us know why you think it's a good idea for one day. Notice
at
how
best it's odd.
All of them, all three of them, one day after the AGM, they add a director. That means they have the full tenure.
I mean, again, I don't know if they're just trying to be snarky, because to your point, they'd be the shareholders would have supported them anyway. So I don't know why you wait a day, but yeah.
Rockwell Automation is a classified board.
So they already really don't care about the shareholders' voice on their board.
Which brings us to pattern number one. 48% of the boards that do the plus 30s are classified.
Yeah,
nearly half.
That makes sense to me, because I especially in 2025, if your board is still classified, you just simply don't really care about what shareholders think about who should be on and off the board. Because you can screw up majorly in 2025 as a director, and yet you might not even be up to a vote until 2028. That makes no sense.
Yeah, well, that's think about it that way, right? So not only is 48% of the boards classified, but that compares to like 35% of most like U.S. boards that are classified. So it's significantly more than average. And half of the directors that are added in plus 30s won't see a vote for 2 or more years. They won't be up.
It's ludicrous.
They get the full tenure. They get no vote for their first appointment, and they don't see a vote for at least 2 years.
Think about it. There could be a data privacy breach. You could have missed attendance for 2 years. You could
not show up anymore.
You could have chaired a pay committee that gave a failing CEO $100 million bonus. There's so many things you could do, and the shareholders have no input of whether you should keep your job.
It might as well be a private board at that point. Whoever's selecting the board.
That pattern does not surprise me that these are happening at classified
Pattern number
boards.
2, and I said this earlier, board expansion. Board expansion right after the AGM is unusually common among these companies.
And again, I don't understand that one because it's clearly part of the bylaws that they're allowed to do this without a shareholder vote. So what's that about?
It's basically
deep down
like,
they know it's wrong.
I think it's a way to just get someone you want on the board. You expand it, you wait till the AGM's over, you add a director, and you immediately fill the role.
It's almost like they subconsciously know that this is wrong. This behavior is wrong, but that's why they're sneaking it after the meeting.
Well, and here's part of the sneakiness. Pattern number 3, network power. So in the free flow analytics data, we have a data point about who you're connected to and the market cap, your influence at those companies and the size of those companies. And when you add up all your connections and the sort of market cap they control, quote unquote, you have an idea of how powerful this person's network is. Boards that tend to do this tend to be highly networked and powerful boards, 16% more network power on average than the non-plus 30s, meaning these are directors that have lots of friends on other boards. There's no better way to get your friends on your board than to do it one day after the AGM with no vote and no accountability for 2+ years.
I was going to say, what it suggests to me is that they're not worried about accountability because they're surrounded by their friends. They're insulated.
Interestingly, the last pattern I noticed was there's less insiders on these boards. These are board-run boards.
Right.
15% less on average insiders on these boards, which would be surprising, except that like an insider, it's not necessarily in an insider, like an executive or CEO, CFO, their best interest to add a director after the AGM. They don't care about that, right? The boards, like getting your board friend on your board, it is in your best interest to not go through the whole rigmarole of a vote and democracy and all the annoying parts of democracy.
Yeah, I was going to say it'd be interesting to look at the influence numbers on freeflowanalytics.com to see. We used to call these boards within a board. That, there's a subsection of the board that actually controls everything. It would be interesting to see, are these occurring at boards where there's a subset of directors that maybe controls the influence of the board, like maybe 3 or 4 directors?
Yeah, I think the next part of this research needs to be looking at the influence on them. I did not see that they were more totalitarian or that they were actually more controlled boards.
But there could be a powerful subset.
But it's just a powerful subset. They were more socialist, which actually means they're slightly more run by committees. The committees have slightly more power than normal boards. I'll leave you with this thought.
Yes.
On directors themselves, of the data I looked at in the last 5 years, only 2 directors stand out as having done this twice. They were added to 2 companies within 30 days of the AGM ending.
Weird.
Jody Taylor was added to the Mr. Car Wash board, which I guess is a real company, 7 days after the AGM.
Right.
And she was added to the J.M. Smucker board.
So
1 day after the AGM.
So jelly and car washing, that seems appropriate.
I don't know why. Maybe Jody Taylor. The question here would be, why do we have to sneak Jody Taylor onto a board?
Maybe she has an eye patch or something they're trying to hide?
Is there a reason? Does she underperform? Does she have a gimp? Does she
bad
smell
breath,
a little
maybe?
bit?
Yeah,
exactly. The halitosis. And Jorge Tittinger.
Yes.
Added to the Form Factor board 24 days after the AGM and the iCore Holdings board 20 days after the AGM.
Weird.
It's very weird data. But look, the end result here is, as you said, these are circumventing the vote. Regardless of the fact that investors on average vote 96% in favor of every single director no matter what, you're still if you want the right to continue voting, you should not stand for corporate shenanigans in which they put people on boards with a full year tenure before you even get a vote.
I would love for some of these directors to get voted off at their first meeting, and when they start complaining and whining, like, why did you do
it happen? Not
say
once.
because you snuck on the board and you could have told us. I mean, that's why we.
Yeah, just tell us. Just tell us. That's right. That's what I got.
Anything else, Matt? That's it. That's a lot. That's the proxy countdown for the week of June 30th, 2025. Join us next week, most likely, when we jump back into the alternative democracy pool. Forever on the lookout for everything now. Shareholder shenanigans, dopey directors, scandalous CEO pay ratios, wayward band-aids, what do you call them? Plus 30 directors who get snuck into the board a day after the meeting. We're looking for everything. That's what we're going to do.